your computer screen. And so, yeah, thank you for joining us. We are here to mark 10 years since the introduction of the Prevent agenda into higher education spaces. And it comes at an exceptionally important time given the crackdown we've been seeing for those of us who are especially involved in things around Kill the Bill and currently around Palestinian solidarity activism, the intense criminalization of protest and of education spaces and campaign spaces in universities, and how this has been heightened since especially the mandatory introduction of the Prevent duty in 2015. So this is an event that has been held in collaboration with SOAS Preventing Prevent, King's Anti-Surveillance, LSE Coalition for Educational Autonomy, and Preventing Prevent at Cambridge. And so hopefully this is the start of a series of events leading into the future where we can come together across campuses and really connect these issues around surveillance, marketisation, privatisation of education, and more broadly, not just prevent, but also connecting to issues around Kill the Bill more recently as well. So Prevent, for those of you who don't know, is one of the 4 streams of the British counter-terrorism strategy called Contest, and it aims to respond to the so-called ideological challenge of terrorism by disrupting a process that allegedly bridges extremist ideology to violence. So I think the main thing that needs to be reiterated here is that it works in a pre-criminal, preemptive space, right? So a crime doesn't have to have been committed, but it's operating in the policing of ideas and the surveillance of ideas and discussions and dialogue, and especially in this case in higher education. So that implicates lecturers, and it implicates all public sector workers in surveilling on patients, whether that's in a doctor's surgery or whether it's your tutor in your tutorials and things like that, really. And it kind of comes down to the idea of policing of ideas and the threat of dissent against the current government, which we know are more and more hostile to issues around freedom of speech, whatever that means these days. So yeah, we're coming together to mark that it's been 10 years, and especially identifying that there has been a significant escalation in the securitization of particular groups, and the way that we've seen Prevent disproportionately affect Muslims, Muslim students and academics, and especially more recently Palestinians in their research and what they're teaching. It's important to come together and understand our own complicity in the situation and how we can resist that. So knowing what our position is and how we can make sure that we're helping those who are most marginalized and most affected and securitized by this racist agenda. So without further ado, I'm just going to go down through the breakdown of what this session will look like, and then won't hear any more from me, I hope, and we'll hear from some of our amazing speakers, and then break out into workshops. So we'll have around half an hour for each of our speakers to, they have a little speech prepared for us, and that will be around 30 to 40 minutes. And then there'll be around a 5-minute break. And then at that time, you can choose which workshop and breakout session that you want to take part in. So the first one will be around knowing your rights and the distinction between the referral and like the environment in which operates before you get to the referral part of the Prevent process, and that will be with Layla from Prevent Watch. And then the second workshop that you could choose is with Preventing Prevent SOAS, which is a bit of a mythbuster session, which will kind of be answering some FAQs and kind of dispelling some of the myths around the Prevent agenda that seem to loom around the liberal left especially. So after that, we'll come back and have some space for discussion around things we might have come here and learn, or things that we hope to collectivize and work towards, and hopefully signpost you with some dates and future resources that we can come back and continue this organizing work. So our 3 speakers today are Sita Balani, who we'll be starting with. Sita is a lecturer in contemporary literature and culture, where she teaches cultural studies and critical theory, with a particular focus on queer and post-colonial theory in the UK context at King's College London. Her research interests include cultural studies, contemporary Britain, post-colonial theory, sexuality and race. Sita's research seeks to unpack the impact of Imperial Histories on Contemporary Culture. She is a co-author of Empire's Endgame, Race and Racism in the British State, and Deadly and Slick, How Sex Makes Race in Post-Colonial Britain. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Sita. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Sabrina, for that introduction. I am partly here as a researcher and a writer, but much more so today as a member of King's Staff and Students Against Surveillance, which is a kind of new campaigning group at King's College London trying to push back against Prevent and the surveillance and securitisation of education more generally. I'm going to talk for sort of 5-10 minutes and try and make some of the connections between the marketisation and commodification of education and the Prevent agenda and securitisation and surveillance. So when I say commodification, what I mean is the treating of education as a commodity to be bought and sold rather than something available to everyone. So I know many won't remember this, but higher education did used to be, if not entirely free, then pretty close to that. And there were grants available and people were not going into huge amounts of debt in order to get a degree. By marketisation, I mean the treating of the field of higher education like a market. So universities are competing against each other for students to keep themselves afloat, but also this happens in like subtle and largely ridiculous ways within the university. So if you're putting on an event, you have to buy your drink and food for your university event from a subsidiary company that the university has created for this purpose. So there's loads of different ways in which the kind of commodification and marketisation works, both in the whole higher education system and within the individual institution. And the reason I say this is because I think it's important to understand that that is the wider economic and social dynamic within which Prevent and securitisation and the Islamophobic work that they do takes place. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of those connections. So precarity, so people in precarious jobs, short-term contracts, and the debt that students get into work together to stop people from organising. So they're designed to keep us docile, to keep us paranoid, to keep us exhausted, and to ensure that we're always focused on how to work our part-time jobs if we're students, or how to keep our jobs if we're academics. They make it incredibly difficult to think beyond that narrow frame. The securitisation also works alongside the enclosure of education. So it used to be, not very long ago, not in the distant past, but in my own memory, many other people on this call's memory, that if you wanted to walk into a lecture in a university and you weren't a student, you could do so. You could just walk straight in through the front door and sit down and take notes, right? So not that many people did, but some people did, and it was completely available to do so. Now, when I suggest this, it seems as though I'm suggesting that you can just walk into Tesco's and take what you want. But in fact, it wasn't like that. It was that you could just arrive, sit down, take your notes, get an education, because no one thought that education was something that had to be kept behind lock and key. And now, of course, you have to go, you have to show your card, you have to swipe in, all of your data is being tracked in that process. And that part is important too. That is also part of the way that the securitisation and the marketisation work together. So the privatisation of education and the securitisation agenda make mad money for tech and surveillance companies. I'll give you one example. So there's a corporation called Gallagher Security. They're New Zealand based but now international. They have a net worth of 1.3 million a year just for their net turnover of 1.3 million a year just for its European operation. And they do kind of small security work at ports, airports, hospitals, banks and universities. And they began their life by building electric fences for livestock, but now they've branched out and they effectively build the same kind of security infrastructure for people and for ideas. So that's the kind of broader background infrastructure of what we're talking about. And all of these dynamics have served to make universities much less pleasant places to be, but also places that extract value from students and workers alike. But there has been resistance to this. So we saw huge demonstrations in 2011 against top-up fees when they were to be introduced by the Conservative Liberal Democrat government. There was huge protests on the street. That was also against the cutting of education maintenance allowance. It was a big kind of wide coalitional group of people coming together. Tory HQ at Millbank was riotously occupied. And there was a real sense of resistance to that. And I think some of that set some of the stage for the Students Not Suspects campaign in 2015. It's also important to note that that campaign borrowed its name from a related campaign against the introduction of border checks within the university. So those two things kind of came about in the same sort of time. More recently, and I know that other people talk about Students Not Suspects and perhaps about Millbank and 2011 a bit more, so I'll leave that there. We saw big picket line teach outs in 2020 and a national day of action during the strike. This was just before the pandemic hit, and so it was promptly erased from all of my memories by the general chaos, but it did happen, I promise. We've seen Palestine in schools just launched in response to the surveillance and intimidation of young people organising in solidarity with Palestinian liberation. We've seen hundreds of Muslim organisations recently refuse to cooperate with the Shawcross Review and to prevent. But we've also seen, chugging along in the background, ISOCs do tons of support work for students facing this kind of surveillance and intimidation. So I just want to really just like big up the ISOCs, who don't always get enough credit for the kind of work that goes on to make sure that Muslim students are supported and have kind of strong communities at university, strong self-organised communities. So I just want to big up that work that doesn't always get spoken about. So where are we now? Well, securitisation and prevent is now entrenched. So if we got rid of prevent tomorrow, the logic of surveillance and securitisation would remain. I think that's important. So even if we managed somehow to abolish it overnight, the rest of that infrastructure that is allowed to be brought into being would remain. So we have to think more widely. And in order to do that, we need to make the securitisation and the surveillance visible. So students are more politicised than ever, especially around race and racism. And universities are trying their very best to capture and contain that energy. So there is tons of money sloshing around in universities for diversity and inclusion work. If you are a student and you have an idea for a project around diversity and inclusion, and you're at a London university or a Russell Group university in particular, they will give you some money to do that. I guarantee it. As long as that's something that they feel that it will not damage them in any way, that does not confront them, or even if it begins by seeming confrontational, they will try and give you some money so that they can kind of contain your energy. The best way to contain your energy from their perspective is money, and it often works very well. So I would just kind of want to set the stage for that warning, because their worst nightmare is not that they have to give you some money. Their worst nightmare is a repeat of 2011 student uprisings, but with the politicisation, the energy, the knowledge, the power of climate strikes, the BLM movement and Palestine solidarity. I'm just going to say that again. Their worst nightmare is a repeat of 2011 student uprisings, but with the politicisation and the energy of you, of young people whose whole political consciousness has been formed on the streets and on the internet, saying we're not having it, we don't agree, we don't feel compelled by your kind of jingoistic national project, and instead we feel compelled by the idea that we should live on a different kind of planet, we should take that seriously, that we should, you know, see the police as a kind of antagonist, not people that are there to protect us, and that we think that Palestine should be free, right? That's what they're scared of. So I just want to kind of remind you that that is what they're scared of, and that if you are a student and you have some ideas, you are in a position of real intellectual and political power, and you should remember that, because they will try and give you some money to shut you up, but you can do an awful lot better than that, and you all are. So the last thing I'll say is that this has been going on for 10 years, but 10 years is not very long. 10 years is 3 cohorts of undergraduates. So 3 cohorts of undergraduates, that's it, have experienced the absurdity and the violence of being educated under these circumstances. But its continuation for another 10 years depends on these circumstances being naturalised. It depends on them seeming inevitable. But 10 years is really the blink of an eye. I think I've got some colleagues that have been wearing the same tie for 10 years. So, you know, we can really start to shift this. They've built this surveillance and securitization and commodification infrastructure in 10 years, but I think we can tear it down much quicker than that. So I will leave that there and hand back to Sabrina.
Thank you so much, Sita. Amazing as always, and I'm not going to even attempt to comment on anything because it's tough to follow that up. But next, Elias does have to follow up. So I am going to introduce Elias Nagdi. Elias is the former NUS Black Students President and currently works on race and equality in education. He has been involved in the Students Not Suspects campaign for the last 5 years, and he's the Equality Charter Manager at the University of Sussex and frequently writes for The Guardian, Independent and Tribune magazine. So Elias, over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much to the organisers for putting this on. Do you know, immediately in the pre-meet, when I realised that I'd be going after Sita, I was literally like, shit. So that's all I'm thinking right now, but I'll try and do the best I can. So in the short space of time I've got, I'm just going to briefly sort of talk about the context of universities in the UK and how Prevent is fitting into the wider political project of locking in major reforms in the sector and shutting down democracy and the space for organising generally within universities. So to understand what's going on in higher education today is, just as Sita was talking about, we need to go back to the period of when it was implemented. It began immediately after a wave of solidarity actions by students with Palestinians in Gaza following Operation Cast Lead, which energized the student movement that had in all honesty fallen into passivity following the defeat of the anti-war movement. And it was these networks of activists and solidarity groups that were reactivated in mass protests by students and workers in response to the sweeping new changes introduced by the right-wing government, which ultimately failed to prevent the legislation passing. In 2011, Prevent was introduced to universities as a voluntary policy before being made obligatory in 2015, with educators trained to spot the radical and policies being rewritten to account for the risk of people being drawn into terrorism. What is often remembered about those reforms in 2010 is the headline introduction of £9,000 tuition fees and the tripling of the prior 3K band. But really what 2010 law represented was a sea change in how universities function, including the withdrawal of public or central government funding in favour of individual payments and the broader transformation of university education into a commodity. In the years since 2011, those twin processes in higher education, those of marketisation under the reforms and that of securitization and the stifling of dissent from students and academics alike, is best represented by Prevent. What the introduction of Prevent has served to do is try and undercut this repoliticization of students and young people. Prevent is not just another policy, but part of a structural process, both in HE and also in wider society. What Prevent looks like in practice is student groups, especially Islamic societies and those campaigning against war, tuition fees and Palestine, finding themselves muzzled by institutions. In schools, we've seen computer monitoring software introduced to identify and flag up words typed out on computers, email systems being monitored for the purposes of Prevent. We have concrete examples like the college student hounded by Prevent officers in his college for his Palestine activism. Police officers told him wearing Free Palestine badge was expressing extremist views. And when organising a fundraiser, he was questioned by his principal on whether the money would be going to ISIS before being told that publicity for the fundraiser could not include quotes from Muslim figures. We have the 14-year-old non-Muslim boy being labelled a domestic extremist and pursued by Prevent for mentioning in class that he was an anti-fascist, and his school claiming that the boy and his father had knowledge of anti-fascist terrorist training camps and/or meetings. We also see this over the last few weeks where myself and other organizations, so me and Asfar set up Palestine in schools, but other organizations have been dealing with upwards of hundreds of cases coming in from school kids from parents across the country about young people being excluded, being put in detention, being isolated, and having the language of Prevent being repeated to them for merely expressing support for the Palestinian cause. But even outside of these actual referrals, we have the day-to-day reality of Prevent woven into all spheres of university life. What Prevent has done in higher education, especially since 2015, is deepen and expand the integration of universities with arms of state surveillance, ratcheting up the risk of political organizing and enabling universities to leverage counterterrorism policy to victimize and target organizers. It has fragmented the forces on campus which should be working together, pitting staff against their students and undermining the solidarity which we know is crucial to any emancipatory politics. And it has contributed to the wider climate of self-policing and forced depoliticization, especially for students who are Muslim. Prevent matters then because it is intended to insulate university management from pressure from below and allow the smooth transition to a fully corporate climate. I think it's necessary that we recognize that Prevent is not alone in doing this, but as was said before by others as well, it is part of an increasing arsenal of surveillance and policing powers forced into universities in recent years and outside of universities, and I think John will be talking about those. But some of those include the immigration monitoring programs, which compel universities to police international students and staff and open them up to detention and deportation. As well as this, we have things like the IHRA definition, which we know polices discussion and organizing around Palestine, settler colonialism and Zionism. It's important to note that these policies don't operate in silos, but interconnect. There have been increasing moves over the last few years, spearheaded by advocates of the definition to equate anti-Zionism and Palestine activism with hatred and with extremism, and therefore expose pro-Palestine activism to prevent referrals. And in my experiences, this has absolutely been the case, with Palestine organizers often at the sharpest end. A Prevent referral, meanwhile, places an individual in the crosshairs of state agencies, including immigration enforcement. So theoretically, a referral could escalate or contribute to immigration intervention. Of course, students and academics haven't taken these passively. There absolutely has been resistance to the securitization. In many ways, activism against Prevent has historically been strongest amongst universities. At a high tide, over 30 university student unions had policies opposing or boycotting Prevent. Last year's Day of Action, which was organized by the Abolish Prevent campaign as part of the UCU strikes, was part of the biggest actions against Prevent in years. Palestine activism, meanwhile, especially in recent weeks, is incredibly vibrant and regularly produces some of the best student activists in the country, despite the immense challenges facing them. And activism around immigration policy has been very strong in incredibly difficult circumstances. So just to close up, I want to quickly mention where I think anti-Prevent organizing in universities has perhaps not been up to par in the way of contributing to some discussion about moving forward. So anti-Prevent organizing has often hinged on one of two arguments. The first being that it is Islamophobic and targets Muslims, and the second being that it undermines academic freedom and other liberal values that are closely held amongst academics. Now, both of these are true, but organizing is about more than just being right, and these often fall short in the course of organizing. For example, an understanding of Prevent as being solely on account of it being racist may lead us to conclude that merely extending it to non-Muslim communities, as some have argued, and as the government is now increasingly practicing, is a solution. But this ignores the repressive function that is core to Prevent and its use as a political tool. Expanding the reach of all it does is expand the reach of a fundamentally abhorrent policy. Likewise, if opposition only extends as far as the academic freedom argument, then this underplays the very real way in which Prevent was made possible only by the racism and Islamophobia and its roots in the war on terror, and it does nothing for the working class Muslim communities at the sharpest end. So we need to do more in the work of our activism to avoid those silos and bring those groups of students, academics and workers in universities together, and especially the communities beyond the university gates, and avoid the silos which have come to define many of the pitfalls of the campaigns in years past. So I look forward to discussing this further and learning from everyone here. And yeah, back to you.
Thank you so much, Elias. And just like with Zita, I'm sure with John, I just found myself nodding. So I'm not sure what kind of effective chair I'm probably going to be. But yeah, thank you so much for that. So last but not least, I'd like to welcome John Holmwood, who is a professor of sociology in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Nottingham. His main research interests are in sociological theory and its history, as well as colonialism and inequality and religion and schooling. And he was an expert witness for the defence in professional misconduct cases brought against Birmingham teachers following false accusations that they were part of a plot to Islamicize schools. His book, The Trojan Horse Affair, was written together with Therese O'Toole and was published by Policy Press. So without further ado, John.
Well, thank you very much. And I feel as if I'm, that figure that Sita mentioned, who remembers when education was free and has also got a tie that they've been wearing for 10 years. So apologies for that background. But it's certainly correct that something really fundamental happened in 2010, 2011 with the government's policies. On the face of it, it was a proposal to triple fees for higher education, but it was a much more fundamental transformation, as both Sita and Elias have said. It did give rise to major student demonstrations and protests, which extended to challenge the wider politics of austerity, which the higher education reforms were a part of. And I think that current developments in Prevent and other legislative programs for higher education that are currently before Parliament following the Queen's speech need to be understood in that context of offsetting and trying to head off the protest and resistance, which was a feature of a decade ago. So let's just say at the outset that the white paper that introduced the new fee-based regime back in 2011 claimed to put students at the heart of the system, but as Sita has indicated, not as agents of their own education, because what it created was an office for students purportedly to protect their interests as consumers, but as we see now, increasingly seeking to manage the behavior of students. And one example of that is in the government's current legislation for free speech and academic freedom, which is directed both at academic staff and at students. In the introduction to the white paper, Gavin Williamson stated that there are some, and this is a quote from him, there are some who prioritize emotional safety over free speech, or who equate speech with violence. This is both misguided and dangerous. And yet, since 2015 and the Counterterrorism and Security Act, the government itself has equated speech with violence. This is precisely what Yasmin said about representing non-violent extremism in terms of a pre-criminal activity. Speech itself was at issue and was to be increasingly surveilled and controlled. And that is, in effect, to treat speech as violence and to identify speech as creating issues of vulnerability and risk. So when non-violent extremism was made subject to scrutiny under formal requirements of safeguarding, this became a mandate on providers of public services such as schools, colleges, higher education institutions, the National Health Service, and so on. And this mandate in 2015 went much beyond the initial introduction of Prevent within universities. And it's in higher education, it's a requirement that is applied to student unions and academic departments to be involved in surveillance. So external speakers must be vetted, their online histories scrutinized, and the subjects of their proposed talks submitted in advance. To give you an example, there was a recent conference of the Socio-Legal Studies Association. This is the primary organization of legal theorists and sociologists and psychologists of law. They held a conference online under the auspices of Cardiff University, which required session conveners to check the presentations of all speakers at the conference a month ahead for its compliance with the university's freedom of speech and prevent policy. And I quote for what chairs of sessions were supposed to check. Is there any information on open source research, e.g. Google search? Kind of ironic that academics should treat a Google search as researching the nature of a topic, but is there any information on open source research to the detriment of the speaker? Would you reasonably expect the speaker or the topic of discussion to attract any protests? For example, are you aware of disruption at events that have involved the same speaker or topic in the past? And significantly, there was no disagreement or resistance from the members of the Socio-Legal Studies Association. It was considered normal and, well, it won't really affect anybody. It's bureaucratic irrelevance, but it's a bureaucratic irrelevance that every one of them complied with. Now, recent research by academics at BCU on a project of desecuritizing higher education has shown that because of their long-standing commitments to academic freedom, most higher education institutions have been careful in their implementation of the requirements of prevent. And Elias has already mentioned that there has been high-profile resistance to it from student unions and from some universities and from UCU. But in the background, there's a degree of compliance from individual members of staff that is worrying. And most HEIs have been conscious of criticisms of the prevent policy articulated by civil liberties groups and those representing British Muslims, that Muslims are the primary victims of the prevent policy in terms of chilling of their speech and, in a sense, suppressing their ability to express their views with a university setting. And so you could say there's been a difficult path to tread between what one can call the statutory requirements of prevent and the government guidelines for implementation. Guidelines are just guidelines and universities don't have to follow them, but statutory requirements have to be followed. And the legislation that has been flagged in the Queen's speech is legislation to tighten statutory powers in order to enforce greater compliance from universities against some indications of resistance, certainly seeking to reduce the discretion of universities. So while the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill is designed to provide police greater powers against demonstrations, and that in itself is highly significant and worrying, it's also evident that what the government is seeking to do is make sure that the risk of protest, the second of those criteria that Cardiff was putting forward, will not be sufficient for universities to cite in ruling against an invited speaker, brackets, where that speaker represents a right-wing cause. It will certainly be used against any speaker representing either a left-wing progressive or pro-Palestine cause. And we've also seen the government's manipulation of reports and inquiries. The most recent is the Sewell report, to deny structural racism and propose instead a problem of victimology. This is the language of emotional safety of the white paper on academic freedom. And so in this context, one of the more worrying developments of the last year has been to place victimology into the category of non-violent extremism, in particular to include environmental activism, racial justice, and anti-capitalism as indications of potential non-violent extremism. Now, of course, the PREVENT strategy was designed and directed against British Muslims, and it scapegoated religious difference. And within this mix of a broader variety of extremisms, the role that British Muslims play continues to be a necessary one, because one of the things that the BCU study showed was that individual members of staff and students are divided about the nature of safeguarding responsibilities, and they accept the language of risk and vulnerability, which the PREVENT duty reproduces and proliferates in the area of terrorism. And so the figure of terrorism, the relation of PREVENT to counter-terrorism, is absolutely fundamental to reproduce the language of emotional safety within the government's own presence. Now, at present, the substantive impact of PREVENT within higher education institutions can be argued to be quite minimal compared, for example, with schools and prisons and even the health services. If, for example, we count measures or the measure by referrals through channel, the primary device of the of PREVENT, but at the same time as the impact on universities has been quite minimal, meaning that academics like those represented by the Socio-Legal Studies Association can think of it as a trivial and bureaucratic exercise. As both Elias and Sita have pointed out, an extensive machinery of surveillance and reporting is fully in place. And this has occurred just as the government is promoting a new authoritarianism, where it presents itself as the protector of free speech while seeking to undermine the expression of opposition to their policies. And so I'll suggest to you that the threat to civil liberties and speech within higher education is real and operates surreptitiously through PREVENT and in the guise of public safety. In 2011, it began with seeking to turn students into consumers, and we're now at the moment where student consumers are being turned into conformists through, or would be, were the government's policies to be successful and were resistance not to put a stop and push back against them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. That's really that was really insightful and took a really different angle, which I'm sure has added to all the other contributions we've had so far. So thank you so much. I just wanted to suggest that maybe we take one or two questions and then move on, because some people have to leave just after this section. So if there's any questions you have for our speakers, maybe one or two we can take, and then we'll move on to having a 5-minute break and then move out into the workshops and the breakout rooms.